Margaret Maggie O'Reilly knew trouble had arrived the moment she pulled the crisp, cream-coloured envelope from her mailbox. The Pinecrest Homeowners Association emblem glared up at her in embossed gold, a symbol she'd come to loathe. She didn't bother waiting to get inside. Right there on the cracked brick walkway her great-grandfather had laid a century ago, she tore open the seal. The letter inside was sterile, legal, and utterly infuriating. Dear Ms. O'Reilly, per Pinecrest HOA bylaws, all properties within the designated zone are subject to compliance with community standards. Your failure to maintain your property, including peeling paint, overgrown foliage, and non-conforming architectural elements, violates Section 12.4 of our covenant. You have 30 days to rectify these issues or face escalating fines and further action. Maggie's grip tightened, crumpling the edge of the paper. Non-conforming architectural elements. That meant her wraparound porch, her stained glass transom windows, the wrought iron fence her grandfather had salvaged from a demolished church. She looked up at her house, a 3-story Victorian with sagging eaves and a riot of climbing roses. It wasn't pristine, but it was alive, steeped in generations of love and wear. Across the street, the HOA-approved homes sat like plastic toys. Identical taupe siding, identical manicured boxwoods, identical brass numbers nailed to identical doors. Like hell, she muttered. The screen door squeaked as she stormed inside, the letter still clutched in her hand. Her cat, Barnaby, twined around her ankles, but she barely noticed. She yanked open the top drawer of her roll-top desk, the one her mother had written letters at, and pulled out her property deed. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were clear. This property, being of historic standing, is exempt from any future restrictive covenants not voluntarily entered into by the owner. She'd checked this a dozen times when the HOA first formed. They had no claim over her. Her phone buzzed. A text from Carl, her neighbour and fellow holdout. Got one too. They're not backing down. Maggie exhaled sharply. Carl's place. A converted barn with a wildflower meadow instead of a lawn had been the second target. The HOA had been circling them for years, waiting for a chance to strike. She typed back, "Meet me at Henderson's, 7 p.m. Old man Henderson had lived in Pinecrest longer than anyone. If anyone knew how to fight this, it was him. That evening, Maggie pulled up to Henderson's cottage, a crooked little thing with a mossy roof and a front yard full of bird feeders. Carl was already there, pacing the porch. Henderson opened the door before she could knock. His face was grim. Figured you'd be coming. Inside, over bitter coffee, he laid it out. They've been pulling this all over the county. Find an old property, slap it with violations, bleed the owner dry with fines. When they can't pay, the HOA puts a lien on the house. Then they force a sale, usually to one of their developer buddies. Maggie's stomach twisted. That's theft. Henderson shrugged. It's business, and they've got lawyers. Carl leaned forward. So what do we do? Henderson's eyes flicked to Maggie. You still got that deed? She nodded. Then you fight. Back home, Maggie sat on her porch, the night air thick with the scent of jasmine. The letter lay on the table, beside her, next to her great-grandmother's journal. She flipped it open to a random page, her fingers tracing the spidery handwriting. They tell us to conform, but this house was built to stand apart. Maggie smiled. Oh, she'd fight all right, and she'd make them regret ever targeting her home. Maggie arrived at the Pinecrest Community Centre 10 minutes early. her grandmother's pearl-button blazer draped over her shoulders like armor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on rows of folding chairs, half of them already filled with HOA board members and their supporters. Their polished loafers and designer handbags made her vintage boots and thrift store satchel stand out like a weed in a rose garden. Carl met her at the door, his face flushed. "They've stacked the deck," he muttered, nodding toward the front. Richard Caldwell, the HOA president, stood at a podium, shaking hands with a man in a navy suit. The county zoning commissioner, if Maggie remembered correctly. "Of course they have," Maggie said, tightening her grip on her folder of documents. "Let's see how they like an audience." She took a seat in the front row, ignoring the whispers that rippled through the room. Richard cleared his throat and called the meeting to order, his voice oozing with the smooth confidence of a man who had never been told no. "Now, under new business," he said, adjusting his glasses, "we have several properties in violation of Pinecrest's aesthetic standards. Per our bylaws, these homeowners will be fined $200 per day until corrections are made." Maggie's pulse spiked. She stood before he could continue. "Point of order," she said, loud enough to cut through the murmurs. "My property was never part of this HOA. I have the original deed right here." She held it up, the paper trembling slightly in her grip. Richard's smile didn't waver. "Ms. O'Reilly, county records show your home falls within our boundaries. If you'd like to contest it, you're welcome to file an appeal." After paying the outstanding fines, a woman in a leopard print scarf piped up from the crowd. "That house is an eyesore. It's dragging down our property values." Maggie turned slowly, leveling her with a look that had made telemarketers hang up mid-pitch. "Funny. My eyesore has stood there since 1873. Your house," she glanced at her folder, "built in 2018. I think we know which one has more staying power." Laughter crackled through the room. Richard's jaw tightened. Carl stood next, his voice rough with anger. "This isn't about property values. It's about forcing people out so your developer buddies can flip our land." Richard's polished facade cracked. "That's a defamatory accusation." "Is it?" Maggie pulled a glossy brochure from her folder and held it up. A rendering of a McMansion subdivision covered the front, the logo of Caldwell & Sons Development emblazoned across the bottom. "Odd how many violation notices go to homes adjacent to your company's projects." The room erupted. Someone shouted, "We voted for upkeep, not a shakedown." Richard slammed his gavel. "This meeting is adjourned." Outside, under the sickly yellow glow of the parking lot lights, Carl exhaled sharply. "Well, we pissed them off." Maggie watched through the window as Richard hissed at the zoning commissioner. "Good. Now they'll get sloppy." Her phone buzzed. A text from Henderson. "Check your email. Sent you something interesting." She pulled it up, her breath catching. Attached was a scanned document. A backdated county agreement rezoning Pinecrest, signed by Richard Caldwell's brother-in-law. The date? 1 week before the HOA's founding. Carl whistled low. "That's not just shady, that's illegal." Maggie tucked her phone away, a slow smile spreading. "And we're going to prove it." The discovery of the backdated rezoning document burned in Maggie's pocket, like a lit fuse, as she pushed through the creaking gate of Old Man Henderson's cottage. Moonlight bled through the oak branches overhead, painting the overgrown path in jagged silver. Inside, the air smelled of pipe tobacco and mildew, the shelves cluttered with leather-bound county records Henderson had borrowed during his 40 years as a surveyor. Carl was already there, hunched over Henderson's ancient desktop computer, squinting at a spreadsheet. "It's worse than we thought," he said, without looking up. "Every home slapped with violations in the last 2 years borders a Caldwell and Sons development plot." Maggie dropped into a wingback chair that exhaled a cloud of dust. "Then we're not just fighting fines. We're fighting a land grab." Henderson limped over with 3 glasses of bourbon, the ice cubes cracking like gunshots in the quiet. "Welcome to modern gentrification," he grumbled. "They don't send bulldozers anymore. They send polite letters with legal letterhead." Maggie pulled out her phone, zooming in on the document Henderson had sent. The signature was unmistakable. James Whitaker, County Zoning Commissioner. The same man she'd seen, shaking Richard Caldwell's hand at the meeting. "We need proof this was deliberate." Carl suddenly straightened. "Got it." He spun the monitor around, revealing a property transfer record. "Look who bought the empty lot behind your house last month." Maggie's stomach dropped. Pinecrest Holdings, LLC, a shell company, but the registered agent was Richard's law partner. Henderson let out a dry chuckle. "They're boxing you in, girl. Once your place is the last blight in their perfect little suburb, the county'll have no choice but to grant eminent domain." The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly in the silence. Maggie swirled her bourbon, watching the amber liquid cling to the glass. Then she set it down with a decisive click. "Then we hit them where it hurts." The next morning, Maggie marched into the offices of the Gazette, the county's oldest newspaper. The receptionist tried to direct her to the classifieds, but Maggie bypassed her completely, zeroing in on the nameplate reading, "Ethan Cole, investigative reporter." The man behind the desk looked up from his coffee, blinking owlishly through wire-rimmed glasses. "Can I help?" Maggie dropped the folder on his keyboard. "How'd you like to expose a conspiracy between the county zoning board and a predatory HOA?" By noon, Ethan had cross-referenced every document, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "This is explosive," he muttered. "But we need something undeniable. A paper trail directly linking Caldwell to the rezoning kickbacks." Maggie chewed her lip. Then it hit her. "What if we bait them?" That evening, Maggie sent a carefully worded email to the HOA board. "After consideration, I'm willing to discuss selling my property. Let's talk terms." The response came before midnight. Richard himself replied, suggesting a meeting at his office. No lawyers necessary. Carl nearly choked when she showed him. He took the bait that easily. "Greedy people always do," Maggie said, clipping a tiny recorder to the inside of her jacket pocket. Richard's office reeked of leather and arrogance, the walls lined with framed awards and golf trophies. He didn't bother standing when Maggie entered. "I'm glad you've seen reason," he said, steepling his fingers. "Though I must say, your little stunt at the meeting was unwise." Maggie forced a tight smile. "I protect what's mine. But everyone has a price." Richard's eyes gleamed. He slid a contract across the desk. "This is more than fair market value." Maggie scanned the number. A laughable lowball. She tapped the Pinecrest Holdings letterhead. "Funny. This looks like your shell company." Richard froze. Then with a slow smile, he leaned back. "Smart. But it doesn't matter. The rezoning's already approved. You'll lose the house either way." Maggie's pulse roared in her ears. "And Commissioner Whitaker helped with that." Richard's smirk was all the confirmation she needed. "Let's just say, progress requires flexible allies." The recorder in Maggie's pocket felt like a live grenade. She stood abruptly. "I'll need time to consider your offer." Richard's smile turned icy. You have until the lien hearing next week. After that, he shrugged. The county will take it. Back in her car, Maggie replayed the recording, her hands shaking. It was all there. The admission, the collusion, the threat. Carl whooped when she called him. We've got him. But Maggie stared at her house through the windshield, its silhouette proud against the twilight. They won't go quietly, she murmured, and she was right. At 3 a.m., the crash of shattering glass ripped her from sleep. A brick lay amid the glittering wreckage of her front window, a note tied to it with red string. The brick lay amidst the shattered glass, like a grotesque paperweight, its threat glaring up at Maggie in jagged red letters. She didn't call the police. She knew whose fingerprints wouldn't be in the system. Instead, she picked up the note with steady hands, folded it into a plastic bag, and placed it carefully beside the recorder containing Richard Caldwell's confession. Dawn painted the sky in bruised purples as Maggie spread every document across her kitchen table. The deed, the rezoning records, the shell company papers, and now the threat. Barnaby wound between her legs, his tail flicking against her calves, as if sensing the storm brewing in her silence. Carl arrived at sunrise, his truck kicking up gravel. He took one look at the boarded-up window, and the evidence spread before Maggie, and his face hardened. We're done playing nice. Maggie nodded. Time to end this. The Pinecrest County Courthouse loomed like a gavel poised to strike. Its marble steps polished to a cruel shine, reporters clustered at the base. Ethan's article had hit the front page that morning, and the words, HOA corruption scandal, buzzed through the crowd like angry hornets. Inside, Richard Caldwell sat at the defendant's table, his tailored suit failing to disguise the sweat beating at his temples. His lawyer whispered frantically in his ear, but Richard's gaze locked onto Maggie as she entered, her folder of evidence clutched like a shield. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with steel-grey hair, called the court to order. This hearing will determine the validity of the lien placed on Miss O'Reilly's property. Proceed. Richard's lawyer stood first, oozing condescension. Your Honor, my client's HOA acted within its rights to maintain community standards. Ms. O'Reilly's refusal to comply. Maggie didn't let him finish. She stood, her voice cleaving through the courtroom. With respect, Your Honor, this isn't about compliance. It's about fraud. She handed a copy of the recording to the bailiff. I present evidence that Mr. Caldwell conspired with County Commissioner Whitaker to rezone properties for personal gain. The judge's eyebrows shot up as the recorder played Richard's smug confession. Progress requires flexible allies. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for the door, phones pressed to their ears. Richard lunged to his feet. That was a private conversation, which documented a crime, the judge snapped. She turned to Maggie. Continue. Maggie didn't hesitate. She entered the brick's threatening note into evidence, then called Henderson to the stand. His testimony about the backdated rezoning documents sent Richard's lawyer into a sputtering rage. When Carl took the stand and revealed the pattern of violations targeting homes near Caldwell and Sons developments, even the bailiff glared at Richard. The judge didn't need to deliberate. She struck down the lien, voided all fines against Maggie and Carl, and referred Richard and Whitaker for criminal prosecution. As bailiffs led Richard away, his cufflinks glinting under the fluorescent lights, he hissed at Maggie, "This isn't over." Maggie smiled. "For you it is." The news vans had barely left Pinecrest when the for sale sign sprouted. Not on Maggie's street, but in front of the McMansions. Turns out, no one wanted to live in a neighborhood run by a felon. On her porch that evening, Maggie sipped, Sweet tea as Carl sanded down her new window frame. Henderson rocked beside her, grumbling about the media frenzy. Barnaby sprawled in a sunbeam, tail twitching at the sound of a hammer down the street. Someone finally fixing Old Man Henderson's fence. Carl paused, wiping sweat from his brow. Think they'll try this again somewhere else. Maggie watched a monarch butterfly land on her great-grandmother's roses. Let them try. Somewhere in the distance, a realtor's sign clattered to the ground.